Hello and welcome to part 3 of our Pictorial whole cloth quilt tutorial. Today we're going to talk about transferring the design that we have pinned to the back of our whole cloth fabric onto the fabric itself. One little tip I'll give you before we get started is when you're doing the oval, if you take one little bite at a time, instead of trying to make one long line around that oval, it makes it a lot easier. It also gives you the opportunity to have another cup of coffee if you want to, because you're not quite so jittery. So just take one little smidge at a time, and you'll get around that oval before you know it. Now we're going to speed this up, just so you can see how it's done, but I'm sure you know how to trace. Now you notice that I'm doing the O Come All Ye Faithful with the church in it, but those of you who are doing the cabin in the woods, you're basically going to do the same thing, except you're going to be tracing the cabin. Now that we have the drawing drawn, we're going to put a couple little safeguards on our trees. You can see I'm marking little X's on the pine tree, and what I'm doing is indicating the areas of the snow, so that when I do the stitching in the tree, I don't accidentally start stitching over the snow areas. Also, if you look at the large tree, the place where the limbs join the main trunk of the tree, there's some snow sitting there. So just go ahead and mark those to be on the safe side. If I did that a little too quickly for you, just simply refer to your information sheet for this class and you'll see exactly where to mark. So, you think we're all done marking? You're ready to start quilting now, right? If you really want to know what goes into the designing of a whole cloth quilt, pay attention to this next part. There are several components that you have to take into account when you're designing your whole cloth. The seam that we just drew out on our whole cloth is the focal point. So that part is done. Now we have to think about other parts before we can say we're finished. Unlike pieced quilts, the next thing that we need to consider is the border. A little different than your normal quilting. But we need to know how big that border is going to be so we know how we put everything else that goes inside of this quilt. If you think back before we even started doing any marking, we positioned our quilt in the center of this piece of cloth, and we drew a rectangle around it using the registration marks. This is a great place to start with your borders and how to figure it out. The other wonderful aid are those folds that you pressed crosswise and lengthwise into your fabric. So this is the border that I've decided upon that we're going to put on this whole cloth quilt. The nice thing about it, doing it on the computer, you can make it whatever size you want. I've decided that I want to make all the spacing in between the scallops 6 inches. And if you notice, we don't have a problem at the corners because each scallop just touches the next scallop. So we don't have any strange things we have to take into consideration. This is a very symmetrical border that we're working with. So let's take all these numbers and do the math and figure out how we're going to do this. By looking at this drawing, you can see the most scallops we can use on the sides are 6, and on the top, 5. So therefore, we need to draw a rectangle 30 inches wide by 36 inches high. To get your upper and lower lines drawn, starting from your center crease line, measure up 18 inches, draw your line, and measure down from that crease line 18 inches and draw your line. Using your vertical center line crease, on this one we want to measure over from one side 15 inches from that crease, and on the other side 15 inches. Now we have those lines drawn, and we have a 30 by 36 inch rectangle. Wow, thank goodness that's over with. Let's do something fun instead. Okay, let's start marking the border. Place your corner border piece along the lines of the drawn rectangle so it lines up perfectly, just like this, and trace your corner border. I actually like to draw all my corners on first and then get ready to do the straight line pieces. And I do that by just laying the border underneath against the drawn rectangle and lining up the scallops and then draw. This also gives you the opportunity, if you need it, to just fudge that scallop just a little bit to make it fit. And here's a little view of how the borders were drawn to give you a little idea instead of just a lecture of how it's done. You should know me well enough by now that I love passing on tips. So here's a great one for this process that we're working on. And what happens if you make a mess? This is where this little mini iron is just the balm. You just take this, put it down against that mark, and voila, it's gone. Now you're on to make bigger and better mistakes as you go along, always knowing that you have your iron to help you out. Now we're going to mark our division points, which are nothing more than boundaries between areas. We're going to draw these division points around the inside rectangle that framed our drawing and around the rectangle that you just got done drawing for your borders. And we're going to draw that 1/4 of an inch away from the original line. Now that was easy. We are now ready to mark one of the 2 contained fillers we'll use in this quilt. This filler will be a diamond grid. I have started my grid pattern by placing the 60-degree angle line of my ruler along the edge of the border surrounding my drawing, and drew a line from the border rectangle to the opposite end of the border rectangle. I continue marking this grid by placing the 1-inch line on the previously drawn line and draw another line. And I'm going to repeat that all the way through, continuing to put my ruler on the 1-inch mark, line it up, and draw my grid lines. Now when it comes time to do the opposite direction, you're going to put the 60-degree line on one of the draw lines. This will give you a line in the perpendicular direction. And as you start doing these an inch apart, you'll end up with a bunch of diamonds. We are going to do this diamond grid the entire way around the quilt within the area between the pictorial portion and the border portion of your quilt. When you get around so far, you just want to make sure that you're going to be on point with your measuring. So I like to take a long ruler and put it alongside my regular ruler and make sure it looks like things are going to line up. Now when you're all done marking these diamonds, this is what you're going to end up with. Here's a little closer view. Are diamonds still a girl's best friend? Or do you never want to see another one for the rest of your life unless it looks like this? Next week we will finally be at our machines. We are going to start on the Trapunto. Now Trapunto will require stitching over previous stitching lines. If you're not comfortable with that, you might get some water-soluble thread. So if you miss a line, once you wet that cloth, no one will ever know. So we'll see you next week. Until then, have fun.